Here is a blue ink by Private Reserve American Blue Fast Dry.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
First off, this is maybe supposed to be the American Blue, just a fast, dry formula, but this is not much darker than their other American Blue, the standard, just a tiny bit. So it's a really good match, as has been the case with their fast, dry series of inks. There is a noticeable tone change by pen, but only really when you look at them side by side. There is some nice shading that shows as very dark spots, even when getting a darker tone of the ink itself. As a fast dry, I think of the target audience being lefties, and for that, I think it's great. Yet, if you watch my American Blue video, you know that I already enjoy this ink, and I like this one just as much.
The pen for today is a Pilot Custom 912. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib. Now, this one does come across quite a bit lighter than the others will, and this because it's a really dry writing pen, which is kind of important to keep in mind. I use that pen to sort of expose anything that might happen like that with the inks. There's no feathering. There is no spread. The shading that goes on is deeply impressive. Looking at deeply on the second line, you see it starts lighter, works its way to very dark at the P, lightens up at the L, and very dark at the Y again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is only a little bit of shading. Looking at little on the second line, you see that all of the beginnings of it are very dark. The L slightly lightens up, and I really don't think it's going to show up on camera. Nobody can blame you for that, looking at nobody on the third line. The no is a darker tone, but the B is a bit darker than what's around it. It lightens up until the up and down stroke of the D. The medium nib is only slightly lighter than it was with the wet fine, really giving a very nice tone here. No feathering and no spread, and you might be worried about whether or not some shading is going to show up. So look at might on the second line, where the MI is a nice darker tone, but the lighter version of it. During the G, it lightens up. The top of the H is a bit lighter than the rest of the word. It goes down light between the H and T, and the T is very dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit lighter in general tone than the medium, yet a brighter tone of blue on the page, really making this something nice to look at. There is no feathering, there is no spread. The shading is making its way again. Looking at making, the first part of the M is that very dark spot. That nice bright blue on the A. Bottom of the K is very dark. End of the K, where all the loop-de-loops are, a bit lighter. I gets very dark. The N lightens up. The G goes from a lighter to a darker tone. Really dwarfs some of the other things going on the page. Looking at dwarves on the first line, starts very dark, lightens up into the word. The end part of the A is very dark, back to a light tone, very dark at the S. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 9 milliliters of ink.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get hairs of shading showing up. Looking at hairs on the third line, starting quite dark, working its way light, and darkens up just a little bit at the E, light into the S again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. You have to prepare yourself looking at the feathers, looking at preparations on the second line. The feathering really is quite obvious there, though it's not out of control and not really a big deal, but it is obvious in its presence. There's no real spread going on. As far as shading, again, if we go back to looking at preparations on the second line, you see that it starts as a lighter tone. It darkens up at the E, goes back into a light tone, and then at the A tones, it gets dark again. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get feathering, furry feathers like rabbits have fur. Look at rabbits, look at the TS. That S has an amazing amount of fur or feathers on it. Really, it's got a tiny bit of spread and barely noticeable. Again, I'm looking at them as a side-by-side, and so I can see it right there, but I don't think you would see that there is some spread without that. As far as shading, again, just to look at rabbits, we do have the slightest bit of tone variation that happens. That TS that is very feathered is a little bit darker than the rest of the rabbit's word. So it makes me worry about getting shading because we got some feathering with it. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter and brighter than it was on the medium. Lighter in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. No, we do get feathering. Sorry, looking at butcher on the second line. You see it at the T to the H where it crosses. You see just a little bit, so not the end of the world. There's no spread that I'm really seeing here. Now, when it comes to shading, it didn't really deliver, although there is some. Look at delivered on the first line. You see it's mostly one tone, but the D at the end does get just a little bit darker. Same thing happens with butcher at the H. It gets a little bit darker, and we get some feathering along with it. Looking at the page underneath, there was this one spot that it bled through with the medium nib, though it wasn't horrible. And you can see where it happened right here, and perhaps I hesitated or it whatever. The back of the page, there's a ton of ghosting. It's really, I don't think you could write on the back of the page with this. I think the fast dry formula has it trying to bond into the paper much faster, giving it a more ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. I see it in fire on the R to E. I see it in going at the G, since at the nince. So unfortunately, we do get feathering a little frequently with this ink. No spread. There is some shading going on. Again, back to fire. The bottom of the F is a bit darker than the top of the F, and the same with the E is darker than the R next to it. But I don't see this, considering its feathering. It's not horrible, but it is there, and not all of the inks we've dealt with deal with this on this paper. It's just not making me feel great about it. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering. You see mountains of it on mountains on the third line. Soon has more than enough of a misty. Funny that it has so much feathering. It gives a little bit of a blurry look. All of them on the third line there. No spread, so that's not in itself a problem. There's no real shading, no mountains of it. Look at mountains again. Only the OU is slightly lighter. Underneath that does go a little lighter to a little darker, but not really for shading here. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. Very close, very close. It's hard to distinguish between the Clairfontaine. I'm going to call them the same. Does it feather? It felt like it a little bit. You know how felt is that kind of furry kind of material? Well, take a look at felt on the second line, and that LT, good God, there's a whole lot of it. Though, what can you do? Looking at though on the third line, that feathers like a monster. Now, there's no spread and there is no shading for you to feel comfortable with. Looking at comfortable, almost nothing. Only at the very end of the word, the LE, tiniest bit darker. But really, this has not been a great performing ink on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium. Tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering. It sticks out in bits. Looking at sticks and bits on the second and third line directly over each other. Tons of feathering, a little bit of spread going on. This is absolutely toasted. When we look at toasted on the second line, there's feather, there's spread, there's nothing for shading going on. This is not a happy ink on this paper. Looking at the page underneath, you see that the wet fine and the medium and the broad all had spots where it bled through touching the page underneath. Now, these are tiny little spots and not the end of the world, but it's definitely there. And when we see the back of the page, we can understand why. There's a lot of ghosting going on with this. Again, I think caused by the faster bonding of the ink to the paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get no feathering and no spread. Thank you, Rhodia, because the last couple papers were a little harsh for this ink, though they're non-fountain pen friendly papers. So the fact that they do as well as they do normally is just speaks to the quality of their manufacture. As far as shading, there is a little bit. It's not as much as it was on the Clairfontaine. Look at little on the third line. The L is a lighter tone. The I darkens up a bit. The first T is lighter. The second T is darker. And when it comes, most of that is relatively dark, except the upstroke of the L. You see that the L, it starts to darken on its way down. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get nothing different when it comes to shading. Look at different on the third line. It's very hard to pick out any part of that that really has any real tone change. So here I'm going to go with it's not shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib, which is a tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now we get no feathering and we get no spread. And remember on the Clairfontaine how it did have some of that shading and really show off some dark spots? Not here. Look at remember. Nothing. All one tone. First line, right in the center, one solid tone the whole way. So these are not the exact same papers, and it would depend on what you're using on which one's going to really work better for you. Looking at the broad nib, the first thing that jumped out to me was some feathering on jumped on the first line. The MPED all have feathering on it, and it is a rare thing that it happens. It doesn't happen, almost at any time on Rhodia, and time on the second line has feathering in it as well. No spread. As far as shading goes, there's nothing to really jump out at you, but again, looking at jumped, the second part of the U is only slightly darker, and the ED is slightly darker than the P next to them. And the Clairfontaine, the shading showed much better than it is here. Look at on the second line, ignoring the fact that there is some feathering between the A and the T. The A is slightly darker, a little bit light in between. It darkens up at the cross of the T and on the downstroke of the T, but it's nothing that's really there as shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Ultramarine Blue. Here is Diamine Denim. Here is Parker Penman Sapphire.
Here is Sailor Yonaga.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. Thank you, composition paper. Now, when it comes to shading, you can't wish for much more than we're getting here with this paper. Look at wish on the second line. Remember, this paper doesn't really bring out shading in ink, but the WIS is lighter than the HE, and the D lightens up a bit. And on the first line, so he sat. The he in the middle, much darker, almost as if it was intentionally giving emphasis to the word. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. As far as shading, for the people that really don't like shading inks, this is going to be a fresh ink for you to look at. Look at fresh on the third line. All one tone, no variation. Really, there's almost nothing to be found here on the paper. You do occasionally see the tiniest bit, but it is not a standout quality here. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread, and don't rush to conclusions about the shading because there is a little bit of shading looking at rushed on the second line that starts as a midtone, darkens up on the HE, lightens up at the top of the loop of the D, but darkens again at the bottom, lightens on its way up into the top part of the D where it gets very dark again. It's doing, I think, a fairly decent job, especially since this paper doesn't always show the shading well. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get feathering. Lord, oh Lord, do we get feathering. Look at Lord on the first line. All over feather. 2, even, 15, could, of, as. I'm just calling off, it's like calling off all of it. I should just read it as feathering. This paper doesn't normally feather very much. That was very surprising to see. Nothing for spread. I think the lines actually look a little bit thinner here than they did on the Clairfontaine, which is interesting in itself. So it's not spread, but it is a narrowing of the line. As far as shading goes, again, back to Lord, the very top of the L is a bit darker, and the up and down stroke of the D is a bit darker. They on the second line starts lighter at the T, but gets very dark at the top of the H, slightly lightening up at the bottom of the H, and then very dark at the Y again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and if it wasn't for the performance on the front, I would say this was a good ink for students, but because of that, I won't.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink. Here is an orange ink by Robert Oster Peach. Here is a magenta ink by Diamine Merlot. Here is a yellow ink by Pilot Mixable Yellow. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering, we do get some spread. The feathering and the spread is really, truly minimal. It's barely worth talking about considering how we saw it on some other papers. But you do see the feathering and the spread occur a bit in things on the second line. It just is there. It's not horrible. As far as shading, when you look at the on the second line, the T is very dark, the T is very light, the he is very dark. Mists directly underneath that starts lighter, gets very dark at the first S all the way through to the second S. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We're at the pinnacle of feather and spread. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but looking at pinnacles on the second line, I think that's one of the cleaner words that's here. That's got some of the least amount of feathering on it in comparison. And when you look at the LES at the end, you really see how much feathering is more or less going on the whole time. The spread's not really that horrible, but it does take it more than a medium, between a medium and a broad. As far as shading, again, looking at pinnacles, the PI is a bit darker and the PI has a little bit more feathering. The ends lighten up a little bit, works its way at the A all the way through the L or through the S to become darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. There is mountains of feather, mountains of spread. Not really, but looking at mountains on the third line, you see the amount of feathering that's going on. It's not horrible. It's not out of control. It's not filling up everything. Looking at filling again on the third line, the amount of feather for what the paper is probably pretty acceptable. When it comes to the shading, there's none. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There is feathering, there is spread, which really closes the distance between some of the letters. Look at distance on the first line. Now, I tend to go ahead and close up my E's anyway, so I don't worry about that, but it spreads the letters together. And it feathers while it does it, making it look like you're writing more with a felt tip pen than with a fountain pen. And once again, we have no shading. Looking at the page underneath, we see that there was a couple of tiny bleed through spots on the wet fine, but only on the wet fine. When we see the back of the page, there's no writing back here because of the extreme amount of ghosting.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The dry soft fine is the lightest tone, and it brings decent shading with it. The wet fine was just a bit darker than I would prefer for this. Now, the medium flow, medium, and broad both gave great tone and a very nice seasoning of shading of darker spots throughout. For me, once again, it is a medium flow, any nib size that really deliver on a beautiful blue tone with those touches of darker shading. So same recommendation here as the standard American Blue.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.